I'm not sure how much longer I can keep doing this job. Sure, the pay's good, but every day I find myself more bothered by the stuff I have to collect and the people I have to deal with. At first, it seemed like a decent gig, but the longer I've been at it, the more uneasy I get. I'll tell you about some of the encounters I've had as a debt collector. Let's just say, things get weird sometimes. Oh, and if Mr. Salazar ever asks about this, just pretend you never saw it. Anyway, the first job that really got me thinking about my doubts in this line of work happened just the other day. I pulled up to the house and parked my car down the street, far enough so I wouldn't draw attention. I figured he'd be home by now, and I needed to be ready. I checked the collection notice again, and nearly did a double take. This one was just as strange as the others, though I guess they've all been weird. I looked again, just to be sure, and yep, it read exactly as I thought. One teardrop from a shattered dream. That's pretty specific, and if I hadn't been doing this for a few weeks now, I might have been completely lost. But after all the odd requests I've seen, I knew exactly what Mr. Salazar wanted. I glanced at the rest of the notice and sighed when I saw it was another one of those poor souls who'd made some deal they regretted. I winced at my own analogy, but it seemed pretty accurate. Something's definitely off about Mr. Salazar, but the money's good, and I'm not about to start questioning his methods right now, not when there's work to do. I grabbed my toolkit, stepped out of the car, and made my way toward the house. The light was on inside, and I could see some movement through the living room window. Probably just watching TV or something, I thought. That would make this easier. If I could catch him off guard, no fight would be necessary. I glanced around to make sure no one saw me and pulled out the skeleton key, slipping it into the door. It creaked open loudly, and I winced at the sound, hoping he hadn't heard it. I stepped inside and carefully tried to close the door behind me. I thought I heard something from the living room, but it faded away. Maybe he was just shifting in his chair. I crept toward the living room, and sure enough, there he was. Scott Bergman, another client of Mr. Salazar, behind on some debt. The collection writs never seemed to list an actual amount owed, just the name, the failure to pay, and the strange item to be collected. I took a deep breath and pulled my Beretta from my coat pocket. It might seem like overkill, but a lot of the people I've visited so far have had their own guns, and after getting shot at a few times already, I wasn't taking any chances. I stepped into the living room, and my footsteps were drowned out by the loud TV. As the noise from the game faded after a big play, I cleared my throat and said, "Hey, Mr. Bergman, who's winning?" He whipped around, startled, and almost fell out of his chair. I thought he was about to grab something, but I stepped closer, making sure my pistol was visible. He froze, and I stepped forward, asking him to please sit down. I'm just here to talk for a minute and discuss what's owed. He sat back down, glaring at me, unsure of what to say, but clearly realizing he was in a tight spot. Despite the threat, I had no intention of pulling the trigger unless I had to. I was here to collect what Mr. Salazar wanted, and that meant having a conversation. He finally spoke up, his voice nervous. Okay. I know what Mr. Salazar wants, but I just need more time. I can't go yet. I have to see her one last time. I tried to figure out what he meant, but found myself wishing I knew more about the bizarre deals Mr. Salazar makes with these people. Then again, I thought about some of the things I'd already seen and reconsidered wishing I knew too much. Still, I needed to understand more about who I was dealing with. What kind of work do you do, Mr. Bergman? Or Scott, if that's okay? He nodded without directly answering, like he was deciding whether he should talk about his job. But when he looked down at the gun I was pointing at him, he finally muttered, "Construction. I'm in construction." I nodded and glanced around his living room, noticing several old high school football trophies on the shelves. "Construction, huh? Well, that's a solid, honest job. Makes me wonder how you got mixed up with Mr. Salazar." "Wait, actually, don't tell me. I don't need to know. But looking around, I'm guessing it wasn't your first career choice," I said, pointing to the trophies. He glanced at them, then back at me, but didn't say anything. He was tight-lipped, making it harder than it needed to be to get the information I came for. I kept the gun trained on him, set my case down, and pulled out the tuner, the strange oblong crystal Mr. Salazar had given me. I didn't like using it every time since it gave me a terrible headache, but I was already breaking and entering, and I didn't want to stick around too long in case someone noticed and things got messy. I turned the crystal in my hands, staring at its center, before tossing it to Mr. Bergman. He caught it without thinking. "Nice catch. You played college ball, didn't you?" I said, watching the light from the crystal reflect off his face in a hypnotic pattern. For the moment, Scott Bergman was oblivious to the outside world, his attention locked on the crystal. I took it back from him, steeling myself as I stared into its depths, feeling my awareness shift. I saw drills, training, formations, and plays repeating over and over. This guy had been a quarterback. I kept staring, and then I saw a pretty girl, Claire. He talked to her at lunch, walked her home, shared a kiss under the bleachers. She was the one he thought he loved. He wanted to be with her, but he had to leave to chase his dreams of going pro. I could feel the guilt in the memory, the tears, the painful breakup. Then I saw the injury, the depression, the failure. His lost dreams. That's when I knew I had what I came for. I hated making him relive those painful memories, but I had to keep myself together. I'd seen some of his story, but I knew if I looked deeper, I'd probably find something less sympathetic. Still, I told myself it was just part of the job. I covered the crystal, snapped my fingers, and Scott snapped back to reality. He cried out, then looked around, realizing where he was. He raised his hands, getting out of his chair, and asked again, "Please, what do you want? I've got nothing left to give. Just tell Salazar I'll find a way to pay him back. Please?" I braced myself for the worst part and spoke again. "Now, Scott, I want to believe you, but I know you. I know you're lying to me, and to yourself. Just like you lied when you told Claire you'd let her go to chase your dream of becoming an NFL star. That's what you told her, right?" His eyes widened in shock, and I could see his anger flare up. I cocked the hammer on the Beretta to keep things cool, making sure he didn't do anything stupid. Before he could say, "How did you know?" I cut him off. "You said it would be worth it. You told her you had to follow your dream. Your dream was to be a star, and hers was to be with you. Well, look at you now. You've achieved something impressive. Most people only manage to shatter their own dreams, but you've destroyed two for the price of one. Now every day you ask yourself, what if? What if I'd stayed? Would she still be here? Well, nobody really knows the answer, but you wanted to know. Now, there's a price to pay." I saw tears welling up in his eyes, and the pain was hard to watch. I almost wished I was just there to break his legs and take his wallet. Breaking someone's spirit? That's way worse. I stepped forward, and he flinched, but I grabbed his head gently and placed a small vial up to his right eye, collecting the teardrop from his painful memory of a shattered dream. I took a step back, and Scott broke down sobbing. He continued to weep softly, apologizing to the memory of his lost love as I turned and walked out of the house. His mind was too lost in the past to notice me leaving. I shut the door quietly, clutching my head in pain. That damn crystal always gave me the worst headaches. I tried to focus on my own discomfort, to stop thinking about what I had just put him through. I had no idea what Mr. Salazar would do with the teardrop, but after this, I felt worse than usual. I pushed the guilt aside and drove off, heading toward my employer. At least someone would be happy today. I made my way back to the little storefront where Mr. Salazar ran his operation. It struck me as odd how many clients he had, considering how mysterious and strange his business was. But I suppose, with the kinds of things he offered, a small, friendly shop wouldn't really be appropriate. I briefly chuckled at the thought of him running a legitimate business, then steeled myself as I stepped out of the car, ready to face the man himself. As soon as I walked in, Lucia greeted me without lifting her eyes from whatever she was working on at her computer. I returned the greeting and asked, "Is the boss in?" I knew it was almost rhetorical, as Mr. Salazar was always there, from what I'd seen. She didn't look up, though, and simply answered with a quick, "In the back." I thanked her and headed toward the back room, but just before I opened the door, Lucia finally looked up and asked, a smirk creeping onto her face, "You get shot at again today?" I wasn't sure if she was joking or genuinely concerned, since getting shot at was a regular risk in this job. I just shook my head, and her grin widened. "That's good," she said, clearly amused. "The last collector wasn't as cute as you, though. Would have been a shame if you got shot up like he did." She flashed that grin again, and I still couldn't tell if she was just teasing me or flirting. Lucia always kept me guessing. Lucia was one of those people you couldn't quite figure out. She was the only other person I knew working for Mr. Salazar, handling all the administrative stuff with impressive efficiency but little enthusiasm. It was obvious she wasn't any more thrilled to be here than I was. When it came to me, her behavior swung between disinterested and surprisingly concerned. A few weeks in, and I still couldn't figure her out. And I'll admit, I wasn't exactly indifferent toward her. Lucia was attractive, and even though I knew workplace romances rarely end well, I found myself open to any attention she might show me. Still, I had to be careful. Despite her desk job and petite frame, Lucia had proven she was capable of handling herself. I remembered the time she single-handedly took down a rowdy client who got too familiar with her. I decided to take her words at face value, smiled back, and replied, "Thanks for the concern, Lucia. I'm all right. Nothing crazy today, just a bit of a headache, which, honestly, is better than getting shot. I didn't know you cared." I shot her a teasing grin, and she returned it with, "Of course I care. Besides, finding someone else desperate enough to work here after you would be a real pain." She laughed, but I still couldn't tell if she was joking or hiding something more serious. She continued, "Just be careful out there. Oh, and when you come back, I'll have a new collection notice from the boss, if you're up for it." I thanked her again, and took the notice before heading into the dimly lit back office. I hated stepping into Mr. Salazar's office. It didn't scare me easily, but there was something about that place that made my skin crawl. Dark, cold, damp, like a tomb that doubled as office space. I tried to push my discomfort aside and walked in. As usual, the place was poorly lit, with only the dim lights on display cases filled with strange trinkets casting any light. Some of those items, I now realized, were far more troubling than I had initially thought. It was also unbearably humid, like the place was being kept warm for a reason. How there was so much moisture in the air, I had no idea. I made my way further into the office and approached the large oak desk. Mr. Salazar was hunched over, sorting through a set of oddly colored vials. When he turned to look at me, his gaunt features twisted into what could only be described as an eerie attempt at a smile. The sight of him smiling always gave me chills, and I briefly wondered what kind of horrific vision I'd see if I ever used the tutor on him. I regretted the thought as soon as it entered my mind and suppressed a shudder. I knew exactly why he was smiling. He only looked that cheerful when he was about to receive a collected item from one of his clients. He pushed his horn-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose, then looked at me. "Hello, Henry. I trust everything went smoothly with Mr. Bergman. You got it, didn't you?" He held out his hand, clearly expecting me to have something for him. I pulled the vial with Scott Bergman's tear out of my coat and winced at the memory of his broken dreams. I handed it over, and as soon as Mr. Salazar took it, I felt an icy chill run down my spine. He set the vial on the desk with a reverent look on his face. The morbid glee on his expression as he studied the tear made my stomach turn. In my time working with him, I preferred it when Mr. Salazar was in his usual grim and intense mood. When it came to any task or deal that didn't involve collecting his strange items, he was strict, impatient, and almost always irritated. But when he was examining the bizarre arcana he collected, his satisfaction was something else, unsettling, to say the least. He had a particular fondness for the items that came from his clients' lives, especially those with heavy emotional costs. He turned back to me, his smile starting to fade, as he patted his hands down on his suit and spoke again. "Good work. Lucia has your payment ready. I'm sure she's already told you there's another collection I'd like you to handle as soon as possible." I tried to hide the grimace that was creeping up, but it was hard. I wasn't sure I was up for another job so soon. Before I could find a good excuse, Mr. Salazar's gaze shifted, growing sharp and intense. I could tell there was no room to back out. I sighed, trying to shake off my unease, and replied with a half-hearted, "Yeah, I can do another one. But I was hoping to get a quick break to see my daughter." Mr. Salazar paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he replied, "I see. Well, Henry, if you're not fully committed to being where and when you're needed, we can always find someone else who is. I'm sure your daughter appreciates the food, the shelter, and all the things a child might want, provided by a father who takes care of her. I'm sure she'd understand when her dad's important work gets in the way of a visit here and there." That sickening smile of his returned, and I could feel the thinly veiled threat in his words. I knew I didn't really have a choice, so I reluctantly gave in. "All right, Mr. Salazar. I'll take care of the other collection today." "Excellent," he said, with a grin that made my skin crawl. "I knew you were the right man for the job from the start. By the way, just a little side note, you might not want to take your car to this one. You'll see why in time." He chuckled and slapped me on the back as I turned to leave, his long, cold fingernails scraping across my skin. I tried to push the discomfort aside, but it stuck with me. I stepped back into the main storefront, and Lucia was waiting for me, holding the new collection writ in her hands before I even had to ask. She smiled and said, "One man's job is another man's extortion. Here you go, hon." I sighed and took the paper, but before I could look at it, she handed me an envelope with my payment for the previous job. I reached for it, but she pulled it back at the last second with a playful grin. "You weren't thinking of taking that payout without asking the brains of this operation out to dinner, were you? To celebrate?" I couldn't tell if she was serious or just teasing, but I decided to play along and said, "Of course not. I would never forget to offer a celebration to the heart and soul of this fine establishment." We'd be lost without you, milady. I bowed dramatically, then continued, How does dinner tomorrow at 8 sound? If I don't get shot before then, of course. Lucia's smile turned more genuine, and I could tell she was happy I had asked. It wasn't just a playful act this time. She really wanted to spend time with me. She placed a hand to her chest as though considering my offer, then chuckled and said, Oh, if you insist, I can pencil you in for then. See you tomorrow, and take care out there. I left feeling torn. On one hand, I was happy I had a date with Lucia planned. On the other, I felt guilty about missing yet another chance to see Sarah. I couldn't help but think of how Mr. Salazar kept me tied to these jobs, making it impossible to spend time with my daughter. But it wasn't just him. It was also her mother, Nancy. She never made it easy for me to visit. I grimaced at the thought. Our marriage had fallen apart after I lost my previous job. We'd already been struggling, but when financial security slipped away, everything unraveled. Things got even worse when Sarah got sick. Desperate for money, I got involved in